Hi, Timothy here, and welcome to Last Memories. Join me as I uncover the stories of the most stupid deaths ever recorded. From a man's annoying attempt to snap a selfie with a total stranger, unaware of his concealed carry, to a Karen driving away from a doctor's direct warning straight into the last moments of her life.
It was June 14th, 2015, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The afternoon had started clear and warm, the kind of early summer day that felt settled enough to get things done outside. Dennis Hartwell, 52, worked as a shift supervisor at a packaging plant on the north side of the city. He had lived in his house on Clearview Avenue for 14 years and spent most weekends working through a list of yard projects he had been adding to for months. He had spent most of that Saturday outside. By late afternoon, he had installed a tall aluminum flagpole near the front of the property, tightened the final sections of a metal fence along the side yard, and mounted a satellite dish on the edge of the roof. It had taken longer than expected, but by early evening the yard looked the way he had intended. He went inside briefly, then came back out as the light began to change. The storm had been visible on the horizon for some time before it moved in. Dark clouds had been building to the southwest through the late afternoon, and distant thunder had been audible for nearly an hour. The Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm watch that morning, though the timing of its arrival had been forecast for later in the evening. The storm moved faster than expected. Wind swept across the neighborhood as the first drops of rain reached the street. A flash of lightning lit the cloud base somewhere beyond the hills, and the thunder that followed came several seconds later. Most of the houses on the block had gone quiet, interior lights visible through closed windows. Every other person on the street had gone inside. Dennis remained outside near the fence line. He had spent the entire day on that yard. He had installed the pole himself, tightened every bolt on the fence, climbed up to mount the satellite dish. He was not going to let a storm that had not fully arrived yet end the day before he was ready. The flag moved steadily against the pole in the rising wind. The aluminum pole stood several feet above the roofline, the highest structure on the property by a considerable margin, positioned in open ground with nothing around it taller than Dennis himself. Another flash brightened the sky. The thunder followed in less than 2 seconds. The short gap between the lightning and the thunder indicated the storm had moved directly over the neighborhood. Dennis stayed where he was. A bolt of lightning struck the flagpole moments later. The strike traveled down the aluminum pole and into the surrounding ground. Dennis was standing only a few feet from the base when the current spread through the soil beneath him. A neighbor passing by on the street saw Dennis on the ground near the fence line and called 911. Emergency responders arrived minutes later and found him unresponsive. Resuscitation was attempted at the scene. Dennis Hartwell was pronounced dead before transport. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest following a lightning strike. Investigators documented the height and placement of the newly installed flagpole and noted it was the tallest metal structure on the property, positioned in an open section of the yard. It was October 22, 2014, in Phoenix, Arizona, at Bell Road and 7th Avenue. Evening rush stacked cars across wide lanes. West sun leveled through windshields. Lights cycled long. An air horn sounded from somewhere back. A hatch clicked open as a driver stepped into the intersection where cross traffic would soon begin moving. Tracy Nolan, 49, worked as a warehouse inventory clerk in Phoenix. Co-workers described her as organized but impatient, especially during her daily commute through the city's busy roads. After a vehicle break-in the previous year, she began keeping an aluminum baseball bat in the cargo area of her SUV for protection when parking at shopping centers at night. That evening, she was driving north along Bell Road toward the intersection at 7th Avenue on her way home from work. Traffic slowed as cars queued at the red light. A silver sedan merged into the lane beside her, and witnesses later said Tracy immediately began gesturing through her window and pointing toward the other driver as the vehicles rolled to a stop. Both vehicles stopped near the front of the intersection. Drivers behind them began honking as the exchange continued while the signal held. Witnesses said Tracy leaned out of her window, continuing to gesture toward the sedan while traffic stacked up behind the light. Tracy then stepped out of her SUV, walked to the rear, and opened the hatch. She reached inside and pulled out the bat. Holding it at her side, she walked into the center of the intersection while continuing to confront the driver of the silver sedan, even as the signal phases were about to change and cross traffic prepared to move. As the signal phase changed, the cross street received a green light and traffic began moving through the intersection. Vehicles traveling southbound entered the intersection with the right-of-way. Witnesses said Tracy continued walking diagonally through the intersection toward the sedan while holding the bat at her side. Her attention remained fixed on the other driver. A pickup truck entered the intersection from the cross street as traffic began moving. The driver braked when he saw Tracy step into the lane, but the distance was short and the truck had already begun accelerating from the stop line. The front of the truck struck Tracy on the left side of her body. The impact carried her onto the hood, where her upper body hit near the base of the windshield. The bat slipped from her hand and slid across the pavement. The truck stopped a short distance later. Tracy fell from the hood onto the roadway in front of the vehicle and did not move. Witnesses stepped back from the lane while emergency services were called immediately. Traffic slowed around the intersection as drivers waited for responders to arrive. Fire and medical crews reached the scene within minutes and began emergency care. Despite resuscitation efforts, Tracy was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported the cause of death as blunt force trauma from the collision with the vehicle. Injuries included severe head trauma and multiple fractures consistent with a pedestrian impact. Investigators measured vehicle positions, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed the timing of the traffic signals. The findings determined the pickup truck entered the intersection during its green phase and that Tracy had stepped into active traffic while confronting the other driver. After the investigation concluded and debris was cleared, the intersection reopened to traffic later that evening. It was May 22, 2018, along the rugged coastline of Big Sur, California. The scenic turnout, known locally as Lover's Leap, stretched 40 feet above the Pacific Ocean, with a steel guardrail separating visitors from the dramatic cliff face below. Clear skies and 65-degree temperatures created perfect conditions for sightseeing, while a gentle 8-mile-per-hour breeze carried the salt air inland. Emily Saunders, a 25-year-old travel blogger, had built a modest following documenting hidden gems along the California coast. Her Instagram featured stunning landscape photography paired with detailed location guides for fellow adventurers. Friends described her as spontaneous and optimistic, someone who found beauty in unexpected places. She had been dating Mark Ellis for 14 months, appreciating his steady presence during her chaotic travel schedule. Mark Ellis, 30, worked in marketing for a regional firm and preferred structured plans over Emily's impromptu adventures. His colleagues knew him as detail-oriented and reliable, though sometimes overly focused on creating perfect moments. He had been planning this coastal drive for weeks, researching the most photogenic stops along Highway 1. The engagement ring had been hidden in his glove compartment for 3 days. That afternoon, Mark pulled his sedan into the gravel turnout and positioned it facing the ocean view. The parking area sloped sharply downward toward the guardrail at a 9-degree incline. He spread a checkered blanket between the car and the safety barrier, arranging a small picnic. The vehicle sat 15 feet from the guardrail, its front bumper pointing toward the scenic overlook. Emily stepped out to admire the coastline, while Mark retrieved the ring. In his excitement, he failed to fully engage the parking brake and left the transmission in neutral. The car began creeping forward on the incline, its 3,200-pound mass gaining momentum steadily. Mark positioned himself between the open driver's door and the guardrail to propose. As he knelt on one knee, the vehicle continued its forward drift. Emily noticed the movement first and instinctively lunged toward the car. The timing created a fatal convergence as the car door swung wider with the vehicle's accelerating momentum. Emily became trapped between the car door and the steel guardrail. The vehicle's weight pressed the door against her torso with devastating force. The door's edge caught her chest while her body struck a jagged granite boulder embedded at the guardrail's base. Her ribcage compressed under the combined impact, fracturing multiple ribs and puncturing both lungs. The crushing pressure severed major blood vessels near her heart, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. 2 hikers on the adjacent trail witnessed the incident and immediately called emergency services. They provided location coordinates while helping Mark stop the vehicle. One hiker guided Mark to reverse away from the guardrail, but the catastrophic injuries had already occurred. Local emergency services arrived within 12 minutes, followed by paramedics and a helicopter medical team. They found Emily unconscious with severe chest trauma and no detectable pulse. Despite immediate advanced life support measures, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report confirmed death resulted from combined blunt force trauma and compression injuries, causing multiple rib fractures, bilateral pneumothorax, cardiac vessel laceration, and massive internal bleeding. The State Highway Patrol investigation determined the incident was accidental, caused by driver error in failing to secure the vehicle on an inclined surface. Physical evidence supported witness accounts of the car's forward movement and Emily's attempt to prevent the collision.
It was August 17, 2016, on a mixed-use block in Detroit, where a man walking home from his shift would make a request so unnecessary that the security footage would later feel less like a crime and more like a slow-moving error you couldn't stop watching. Darren James Spears was 28 years old and worked as a forklift operator at a regional warehouse, a job that required precision and left him with sore shoulders by the end of every afternoon shift. He lived alone in a studio apartment above a check-cashing storefront, and probably just like most of us, he spent most evenings scrolling through social media, trying to assemble an online persona that felt better than his actual life. Friends described him as quiet, reliable, someone who showed up to cookouts with potato salad and left early. I personally think Darren had confused the internet's appetite for menace with actual human interaction, and that confusion cost him everything he had. He had been walking the same route home for 3 years. That evening, he spotted a man in a worn leather jacket and heavy boots, leaning against the metal grate of a closed pawn shop. Now the speculation surrounding the incident is that Darren likely saw a photo opportunity, something gritty, something that would make his profile look like he moved through spaces where people didn't apologize. He approached the stranger. The man refused. Darren stepped closer anyway, phone already raised, framing the shot with the selfie camera. When the man turned his face away, Darren reached out and briefly grabbed the sleeve of the leather jacket, laughing and telling him it would only take a second. I think most people would have stopped after the first refusal. But Darren had already committed to the version of himself that didn't back down. The block was otherwise empty. A hot dog vendor was packing up about 200 feet south. 2 pedestrians stood outside a check-cashing store, sharing a cigarette and watching. Storefront CCTV captured the entire exchange at a low angle. Darren smiled nervously, still trying to position his arm for the shot. Phone extended, the stranger's face half obscured by shadow. The footage was grainy in the fading light, but investigators later said Darren appeared to keep talking as he moved closer. The man shifted his weight. His right hand went to his waistband. Darren either didn't notice or didn't process it in time. The man pulled a semi-automatic handgun. The CCTV footage showed the barrel rise in a quick upward motion. One pedestrian later told investigators they heard a single word, "leave," before the shot. The sound was flat and hard, like a metal door slammed against concrete. Darren's phone flew from his hand. He collapsed onto the sidewalk without a sound, his body folding sideways, his leg twisting awkwardly beneath him as he hit the concrete. The man ran east. The 2 pedestrians froze for a few seconds before one pulled out a phone. Darren was still alive when paramedics reached him, but barely. He died en route to the regional medical center. The coroner's report, in plain terms, described a single gunshot wound to the upper left chest, perforation of the heart, and massive internal hemorrhage. Death was determined to be rapid but not instantaneous. Consciousness likely lost within 10 to 15 seconds. The shooter was arrested 2 blocks away, still wearing the same jacket. Officers responding to the shooting were already patrolling less than a mile away on an unrelated disturbance call when witnesses pointed them toward the suspect's direction of travel. Police records later confirmed prior violent charges. Darren's family had his social media accounts deactivated within the week. No public statement was ever issued. Crucify me for this, but I think the tragedy here isn't the gun. It's that Darren walked past dozens of people every day without incident, and the one person he chose to approach was the one person he should have left alone. Some doors don't need to be opened for a selfie. Most doors, actually. It was July 20th, 2017, and Phoenix was in the middle of one of its most punishing summers. Temperatures at the city's main airport were hovering above 105 degrees that afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the tarmac shimmer. It was a busy travel day. Gates were full, ground crews were moving efficiently, and flights were running on schedule. Carolyn Floss was 45 years old. She worked in retail management, the kind of role where authority was the default, and being overruled didn't sit well with her. By multiple accounts, she was someone who pushed hard against rules she found inconvenient and expected exceptions to be made. On that afternoon, she was traveling with her 14-year-old nephew, and the two of them arrived at their gate late. Not marginally late, but late enough that boarding calls had already gone out multiple times. By the time they got there, the jet bridge door was sealed. The aircraft, a smaller regional jet, had finished boarding, and the crew was already in pre-departure procedures. A gate worker explained the door was closed and the flight was not returning to the gate. That did not go over well. Carolyn began arguing with the staff, raising her voice, filming the encounter on her phone, and accusing the workers of abusing their authority. Other travelers watched. Multiple staff members tried to de-escalate. None of it landed. I want to be fair. Missing a flight with a teenager in tow is genuinely stressful. I get that. What I don't understand is what she did next. While attention near the gate briefly shifted, she moved toward a service access point along the side of the terminal, a door used intermittently by ground crew for ramp access. In that narrow window, she made it through into the secured ramp area. An alarm activated the moment she crossed that threshold. Ground personnel on the ramp spotted her and moved to intercept, shouting for her to stop. She did not. She continued moving across the active tarmac toward the aircraft, which had just begun taxiing away from the gate with its engines running at low to moderate power. The fact that it was a smaller regional jet matters here. That type has engines mounted lower on the fuselage, which puts the intake hazard zone much closer to ground level. Most people never think about what that kind of engine does to the air around it. By the time you feel the pull, you're already past a point of no return. As she moved into the marked hazard perimeter, the airflow became strong enough to disrupt her footing. Witnesses on the ramp later reported seeing loose debris near her shifting toward the engine. Her clothing pulled forward. She lost her balance and went down on the pavement. The intake forces at that range pulled her further forward after she lost her footing, drawing her deeper into the immediate hazard zone where she sustained severe blunt force trauma. The flight crew initiated an emergency engine shutdown within seconds of visual confirmation. But that call, fast as it was, came too late. This is the story I just couldn't stop thinking about. Not because it was so shocking, but because she had so many chances to turn around and just kept going. Emergency responders secured the ramp area within minutes. Carolyn Floss was pronounced deceased at the scene. Her nephew, who stayed in the gate area, was taken into the care of relatives. He was not physically harmed. Investigators reviewed alarm logs, ramp footage, and statements from gate staff and ground crew. Findings were consistent. Safety systems were active and functioning throughout. Warnings had been issued at every stage. She continued past all of them. The incident was classified as a fatality resulting from unauthorized entry into an active aircraft movement area and contact with engine hazard forces. No equipment failure was identified. No airport procedural failures were found. Everything worked. The alarm triggered. The crew responded. The systems did exactly what they were built to do. The only thing that failed was the one decision that started all of it. It was December 31st, 2015, in the Kreuzberg district of Berlin, Germany, where a neighborhood celebration had been building since dusk, the kind of gathering that ends with someone on the ground and everyone else standing over them, trying to remember what they should have said an hour earlier. Emre Voss was 27 years old and worked the morning counter at a small, independent coffee shop in the Neukölln district, where he had been a fixture for 3 years. Co-workers described him as magnetic and exhausting in equal measure, someone who turned every routine moment into a performance. His close friends had a shorter version. He didn't know when to stop. As I read further into the story, apparently, he had no history of recklessness beyond his general appetite for being the center of things. He had purchased a collection of consumer fireworks from a street vendor earlier that evening, which in Berlin on New Year's Eve is as routine as buying bread. The larger rocket-type devices he bought were roughly 14 inches long and built to be placed upright in a bottle or tube before ignition. He held the rocket awkwardly at an upward angle in his bare hand, rather than placing it in a bottle for stability. He had been the one to suggest the fireworks, the one to carry them across the neighborhood, and the one who decided sometime around 11:40 p.m. that he wanted to hold one at an angle rather than setting it on the pavement. His friends told him to put it down. He laughed. The street outside was lit by the ambient glow of the city and scattered pops from adjacent blocks. The temperature was below freezing. A light layer of snow covered the cobblestones. The group had been together for hours. The mood loose and celebratory. The kind of night where someone's bad idea gets laughed off until it doesn't. He gripped the device in his right hand, angled upward and away from the group, fuse burning. At least 2 people stepped back. One reached toward him. The rocket wobbled slightly as he gripped it, a subtle motion unnoticed by most of the group before the explosion. He adjusted his grip. Despite repeated warnings, the fuse was already too short to react once he ignored them. The device detonated in his palm. Witnesses described the explosion as immediate and total. No escalation, no warning distinct from the hiss of the fuse. The primary blast fractured his right hand at the metacarpal bones, with the concussive force traveling upward through the wrist. Shrapnel, casing fragments, and propellant debris entered his lower face and throat. He was standing when it happened. I want to be direct about this. Every person in that group saw what was about to happen. This was not a malfunction. He was on the ground within seconds. The snow around him showed visible blood spread across an area of roughly 3 feet. 2 friends reached him immediately. One pressed a jacket against his face and throat. Another ran toward the nearest corner, calling for emergency services. A third witness was described as standing completely motionless. Nobody in that group was trained for what they were looking at. Emergency services arrived within 12 minutes. Paramedics worked at the scene before transport. He was pronounced dead before reaching the hospital. The coroner's findings, in plain terms, Emre died from blast-related trauma to the right hand, face, and anterior throat. The primary cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, resulting from vascular disruption in the neck. Shrapnel had severed or lacerated major vessels that could not be controlled in the field. The hand injuries alone would have required surgical intervention. The throat injuries were not survivable without immediate access to an operating room. Police recovered fragments of the device from the scene. His friends held a private gathering the following week. No formal memorial was placed at the site. The firework did exactly what it was engineered to do. It just did it in someone's hand. His friends warned him more than once, and I don't think any of them have stopped thinking about whether one more word would have changed anything. Probably not. Some decisions close faster than the people around them can react. The fuse was already lit before anyone realized the conversation was effectively over. That's not a comfort. It's just what happened.
It was March 3, 2015 in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. The chocolate manufacturing plant ran production through the evening shift without interruption, the building warm and loud against the cold outside. Raymond Ost, 49, had worked on the production floor for 11 years. He knew the facility better than almost anyone on the evening shift. Supervisors trusted him to complete equipment checks alone without needing to report back at every station. That night, he had been assigned a routine walkthrough covering several machines across the floor, including the large mixing tank positioned near the center of the facility. The tank held several thousand pounds of heated liquid chocolate and fed multiple production lines simultaneously. A raised steel inspection platform sat above it, roughly 6 feet off the ground, reached by a short flight of metal steps. Built into the heavy sealed lid was a large maintenance access hatch, wide enough for a person to fall through, kept locked during normal production. A hinged guardrail section beside the hatch could be opened to give technicians closer access to the lid during servicing. Earlier in the shift, operators had noticed the chocolate mixture thickening around the mixing shaft. Maintenance technicians had inspected the tank, examined the shaft from above, and returned the equipment to production. When they finished, the hatch was left unsecured and the guardrail section was left open. Neither had been properly reset before the line resumed. Raymond reached the mixing tank during his walkthrough and climbed the metal steps to the platform. The open hatch and the open guardrail section were immediately visible. The correct procedure at that point was straightforward. Report the unsecured equipment to a supervisor, have the line paused, and wait for the hatch to be properly closed before conducting any check. A sign mounted on the platform clearly stated that the hatch was not to be approached during production without 2 personnel present, and the agitator fully locked out. Raymond did not call it in. He did not wait for a supervisor. He did not request a second person. He decided to conduct the check himself. Warm vapor rising from the heated chocolate below had left condensation across sections of the metal grating underfoot. He approached the open hatch alone and leaned forward over the unsecured opening to look down into the tank. Several feet below, the agitator turned slowly through the thick liquid. He shifted his footing on the damp grating to get a better angle. His foot slipped. With the guardrail beside the hatch still open and no second person present to catch him, there was nothing between him and the opening. He fell through the maintenance access hatch into the tank below. The agitator continued turning. Production across the rest of the facility continued without interruption. The surrounding machinery produced constant noise across the floor. No one witnessed the fall, and nothing on the production floor indicated anything had changed. As the shift progressed, supervisors assumed Raymond had moved further along his inspection route. After nearly an hour without contact, they began attempting to reach him by radio. When repeated calls went unanswered, a search of the production floor was organized. Workers checked each station along his assigned route one by one. Every location came up empty. When no one could account for his whereabouts, attention turned to the mixing tank. The tank was shut down and the lid opened. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Fire department rescue personnel and paramedics recovered Raymond from inside the tank. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as drowning after immersion in an industrial liquid. Investigators cited several contributing failures, including the maintenance override left active, the hatch left open, the guardrail left unsecured, and the lockout procedures that had not been completed before production resumed. Following the investigation, the facility installed additional safety interlocks on the tank hatch and revised its lockout procedures to require supervisory confirmation before the equipment could be restarted. It was July 29, 2015, in Union County, New Jersey, at the Garden State Parkway toll plaza near exit 140. Summer heat hung over dense weekend traffic as long toll lines crept toward the booths. Easy pass-only lanes moved slightly faster, while the staffed booths slowed to a crawl. Across the slowed lines, Lydia Crane, 57, owned a small residential cleaning service in Newark. Her days were spent driving between supply warehouses and apartment jobs across the city, often trying to squeeze extra appointments into a tight schedule. Employees described her as impatient with delays and quick to argue when something slowed the day. Traffic and long toll lines frustrated her, and stalled lanes often led to disputes with workers or other drivers. That morning, she was heading south for supply pickups and 2 cleaning estimates, which meant using the Garden State Parkway despite the usual weekend congestion. The toll plaza near exit 140 carried steady traffic heading toward the coast, with signs warning drivers to remain inside their vehicles, while easy pass lanes continued moving through the booths faster than the staffed lanes. Lines feeding the staffed toll booths stretched across the pavement. Cars moved forward a few feet at a time as each booth cleared another vehicle. When the line paused again, Lydia opened her driver's door and stepped out, leaving her sedan in the booth lane. Witnesses said she walked toward the toll window with her hands raised, angrily complaining about the delay and the slow-moving line. The attendant signaled for her to return to the car because traffic was still moving through the plaza. Lydia turned toward the line of cars behind her and threw her arms out in frustration. Drivers began honking as the booth lane remained blocked. Instead of returning to her vehicle, she walked away from the booth area toward the striped pavement separating the booth lanes from the EZ pass lanes. Several drivers shouted for her to stop as she stepped past the painted hash marks that marked the restricted zone. The markings separated the stopped toll lanes from the EZ pass lanes where vehicles continued moving through the booths. Lydia ignored the warnings and continued across the striped pavement, moving directly toward the EZ pass lanes. Vehicles were still passing through the EZ pass lanes as drivers slowed while approaching the toll canopy. Lydia stepped into the first EZ pass lane while looking toward buildings across the roadway, apparently trying to cross the plaza instead of returning to her car. A commuter sedan entered the EZ pass lane, traveling about 30 miles per hour as traffic slowed, approaching the toll canopy. Witnesses said the driver braked as soon as Lydia stepped into the lane, but the distance was short. The front right side of the sedan struck Lydia before she reached the center divider. The impact lifted her onto the hood before she rolled off onto the pavement as the car came to a stop. Drivers in the booth lanes stopped and moved back as emergency services were called, and toll workers halted traffic through the easy pass lanes. Responders arrived within minutes and attempted life-saving measures, but Lydia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported severe blunt injuries to the head, chest, and pelvis that stopped breathing and circulation within minutes. Investigators spent hours documenting the toll area, and Lydia's sedan still waiting in the booth lane where she left it. Witnesses confirmed she walked into the traffic lanes despite warnings. The driver remained at the scene and cooperated. Investigators concluded the driver had no reasonable chance to avoid the collision. It was March 14, 2016, when the bright arena lights illuminated the polished hardwood court of a mid-sized sports facility in the American Midwest. The evening air carried the familiar sounds of a packed house, sneakers squeaking against the floor, and the growing murmur of anticipation from nearly 8,000 spectators. 27-year-old Zula Gragg arrived at the venue 3 hours before tip-off, his usual routine as an event operations assistant. Standing just over 6 feet tall with an athletic build, Zula had worked in sports entertainment for nearly 4 years, coordinating halftime shows and promotional events. Colleagues knew him as enthusiastic and reliable, someone who volunteered for high-visibility assignments and took pride in creating memorable experiences for fans. That evening, however, Zula had planned something unprecedented. Hidden in a storage room beneath the arena sat an 85-pound mascot costume, a full-body animal suit complete with oversized foam head, thick chest padding, and limited vision through narrow mesh slits. The costume's internal cooling system had malfunctioned weeks earlier, leaving only passive airflow for ventilation. Zula intended to surprise his girlfriend by emerging at center court during halftime and proposing marriage in front of thousands of witnesses. As the first half wound down, Zula made his way to the storage area and began putting on the costume. Zula had already been sealed inside the costume for more than 40 minutes, waiting in a storage corridor beneath the arena to preserve the surprise with no airflow beyond what the suit allowed. The rigid torso shell fit snugly around his chest and shoulders, while the massive headpiece added significant forward weight. No handler had been assigned to assist. As halftime began, the arena's sound system filled with upbeat music, while Zula, now fully enclosed in the costume, made his entrance onto the court. The crowd's energy immediately shifted toward the unexpected mascot appearance. Moving carefully across the polished surface, he positioned himself at center court. Inside the costume, heat had already begun accumulating around his torso and head. The proposal sequence began when Zula lowered himself onto one knee, extending a padded hand that held a small ring box. The crowd erupted in recognition of the romantic gesture. He maintained the pose for nearly 30 seconds as his girlfriend approached from the sidelines, visibly emotional. Inside the costume, however, Zula's body was reaching a critical threshold. The physical exertion of moving in the heavy suit, combined with the emotional intensity and the complete lack of cooling airflow, had elevated his core temperature to dangerous levels. The thick padding trapped metabolic heat against his skin. As his girlfriend accepted the ring, Zula attempted to stand but wavered noticeably. The crowd interpreted this as part of the performance, laughing and cheering. He took 2 unsteady steps forward before collapsing onto the court, the massive costume crashing against the hardwood. For nearly a minute, the crowd continued cheering, assuming the collapse was part of an elaborate performance. Only when the mascot failed to move did arena staff approach. Multiple personnel struggled to remove the heavy headpiece due to its locking mechanism. Once freed from the costume's head section, Zula was found unresponsive, his skin flushed and hot to the touch, with no detectable breathing. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but pronounced him deceased at the scene. The medical examiner's report confirmed hyperthermia and heat-induced cardiac arrest as the cause of death, noting a core body temperature consistent with severe heat stroke.
It was October 23, 2015, in a 24-hour supermarket on the northern edge of São Paulo, Brazil. Have you ever done something small and routine that you didn't know would be your last? A woman climbed a shelf to make her son smile, and the building held its breath. Luana Ribeiro, 24, worked the evening cashier shift 6 nights a week. She had given birth at 18 and raised the boy alone since, living in a small apartment a 15-minute bus ride from the store. Coworkers said that she often rushed home to make dinner. That night, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., she stayed inside. Her son, home with a babysitter, had asked via text message for help picking cereal. Luana decided to take a picture of the entire cereal section from above, and judging from their relationship, she likely did it to make him laugh. She probably knew a stepladder existed in the back maintenance aisle, but she didn't go for it. I mean, we've all been there, skipping steps to get to the end faster. Now it's dumb and stupid, but for a parent, they've probably done something a little reckless to make their child smile. Unfortunately, most don't pay for it like this. The gondola shelving unit she climbed was not weight-rated for climbing. It was part of an older system with missing stabilizer brackets along one side after recent maintenance work, bolted into a concrete floor that had settled unevenly over years of use. A forklift had reportedly clipped the lower base several weeks earlier, leaving the frame slightly misaligned. The supermarket at that hour was quiet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating empty aisles and the occasional stock boy restocking chips. The cereal aisle stretched nearly 100 feet, boxes stacked in neat rows. Luana placed her phone on a nearby shelf, angled it upward, then stepped onto the bottom metal ledge of the unit. She pulled herself to the second shelf, then the third. The shelf held discount canned food displays on the lower rows near the aisle entrance, moving to lighter cereal boxes above. She shifted her weight to adjust the phone angle, reaching one hand higher. And then, the shelving unit began to tilt. Not fast, a slow forward lean, like something waking up. A can of black beans slid off and hit the floor with a hollow clang. Then another. The entire gondola started to go. Security cameras captured the full collapse from two angles. The unit tipped forward in what investigators later measured as approximately 3 seconds. Stacked canned goods rained down first. Tomato paste, corn, peas, with several cans visibly striking the floor around her as she tried to climb back down. Then the cereal boxes, lighter but many. She tried to step back, but her foot caught on a metal bracket. The shelving unit came down on top of her, pinning her diagonally across the lower shelves. The falling frame struck the neighboring unit hard enough to partially dislodge several connected sections, sending additional products spilling into the aisle. Fire rescue arrived, called in by one of the clerks. They used hydraulic spreaders to lift the shelving, which gives you an idea how heavy these things are. Luana was out cold when they pulled her out. She was transported to a regional hospital where her son was allowed to visit her. She never woke up. The coroner's report, in plain terms, described death from blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen from falling stock, combined with crush-related complications after prolonged compression that caused severe internal bleeding and organ failure. She died the following morning. It wasn't an immediate death. A slow one, enough for his son to watch her die. Her son was 7 years old. The supermarket paid for the funeral. Her co-workers organized a meal train for the boy and his grandmother, who took custody. Municipal labor inspectors later examined the damaged shelving system and reviewed prior maintenance records from the store. The stepladder remained in the back aisle, exactly where it had been. We can all look at the footage and see how stupid this accident is, but I can't stop thinking about how she was just trying to be a good mom after a long shift. Being a single mother is hard enough without a cereal shelf taking you out of the picture. That shouldn't have been the last thing she did for his son.
It was August 18th, 2015, and San Antonio, Texas was deep into its summer. Afternoon temperatures were sitting above 95 degrees, the kind of heat that shortens tempers and makes everything feel more urgent than it probably is. The neighborhood was quiet on the surface. Residential streets, fenced yards, houses set close together. The kind of block where raised voices carry between properties and a dispute between neighbors doesn't stay private for long. By the time the argument reached the fence line, at least one neighbor had already stepped outside to see what was happening. Zenny Crin was 47 years old. She worked in logistics dispatch, a role that runs on pressure, tight timelines, and the expectation that problems get resolved quickly. People who knew her described her as someone who didn't back down easily in a conflict and who pushed harder when she felt she wasn't being heard. On the afternoon she died, she was in the middle of an argument with a homeowner, a man in his mid-50s who worked in contracting, over a vehicle parked in a way she found unacceptable. The argument had started at the street and moved toward the property line. What strikes me about cases like this is that the personality description almost always sounds the same. Someone who pushed back, who didn't back down. And every time, I find myself wondering if they knew that about themselves, or if it just felt like being right. The homeowner was inside his yard, behind a closed gate. He told her clearly not to open it and come in. The reason was direct. There was a dog loose on the property, and it was territorial. He wasn't being vague. He was telling her exactly what would happen if she came through that gate. Neighbors outside at the time later confirmed they heard the exchange. She opened the gate and stepped into the yard. The dog, a large, powerful breed consistent with guard-type dogs documented in the area, was loose within the enclosed space. A fenced yard with a single gate doesn't offer many options when something goes wrong, and the gate she had come through was now behind her. The dog reacted immediately. The combination of an unfamiliar person entering the enclosed space and the elevated voices of the ongoing argument triggered a defensive response. It moved toward her and made contact before she could turn back toward the gate. She attempted to retreat. In the initial struggle, she lost her footing and went down. Once on the ground, the dynamic shifted. The dog targeted the upper body and neck, behavior consistent with territorial defensive aggression in large breeds during a sustained encounter in a confined space. The enclosed yard gave her nowhere to move. The homeowner moved to intervene. Neighbors who heard the commotion called emergency services. The attack continued for a sustained period before the dog was successfully restrained. Witnesses described the homeowner making repeated attempts to intervene before the animal was finally brought under control. The confined space, the fall, and the time it took all contributed significantly to the severity of what followed. Severe trauma and significant blood loss occurred during the encounter, particularly from injuries sustained to the upper body and neck. Emergency responders arrived and secured the scene. Zenny Kryn was pronounced deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was traumatic injuries and blood loss sustained during the attack. Animal Control took custody of the dog for evaluation in accordance with local regulations. The homeowner cooperated fully with investigators throughout the process. Witness statements from neighbors confirmed that multiple warnings had been given before she entered the yard. The gate had been closed. The warning had been explicit. Investigators concluded the incident was a fatal animal attack following unauthorized entry into a secured private property. The record was straightforward. The warning was documented, the entry was documented, and the outcome followed directly from that one decision. I don't say this to be harsh, but the homeowner did everything right in that warning. He told her what was in the yard, why she shouldn't enter, and what the risk was. The outcome wasn't a failure of the warning. It was a failure to take it seriously. It was August 11, 2017, on the western outskirts of Lahore, Pakistan, where a flat, sun-cracked vacant lot sat wedged between a shuttered textile warehouse and a row of low concrete homes. The kind of place that accumulates both trash and young men with nowhere better to be on a Friday afternoon. Rashad Mirza was 21 years old and worked part-time loading freight. He had grown up 3 streets from the lot and had been part of this group since he was 15. His reputation inside the circle was straightforward. He was the one who always volunteered first. His older brother later told investigators that Rashad had been saving money to enroll in a vocational welding program and had already paid the registration fee the week before. That detail stayed with me. The fee was still recorded in his phone's expense notes, sitting there. The group had no particular plan going into that afternoon. These gatherings rarely did. Someone had sourced a large agricultural tractor tire weeks earlier, and over several sessions, they had rigged a motorized spinning frame from scavenged engine parts and salvaged steel pipe. The concept, loosely, was to build enough rotational force in the tire and release it down a bamboo and warped plywood ramp, watching how far it would travel. Several of them had already run smaller tests with car tires. Nobody in the group had any background in mechanics or applied physics. I think as far as they were concerned, none was needed. A large agricultural tractor tire of this type typically measures around 5 feet in diameter and weighs close to 300 pounds. The ramp they had assembled was not anchored to the ground. The plywood had already warped from previous sessions in the heat. That afternoon, the tire had been spinning for close to 4 minutes before anyone moved toward the release mechanism. Rashad stepped forward to check the alignment between the ramp and the frame. He was standing within roughly 2 feet of the tire's projected path. One of his friends positioned himself at the release. The countdown started, loud and half-joking, the way these things often begin. The frame had begun to wobble slightly under the strain, but no one stepped back. The tire did not travel down the ramp. The moment the restraint released, the motorized frame torqued sideways, the result of uneven tension in the motor mount that no one had identified or checked. The motor continued spinning briefly as the frame twisted, adding to the unpredictability of the tire's trajectory. The tire launched at an oblique angle rather than straight forward. It covered approximately 6 feet in under a quarter of a second. It struck Rashad across the forehead and the right orbital region. Witnesses described the sound as flat and immediate, distinct from the dull impact the tire made when it hit the ground a moment later. Rashad dropped straight down, no stumbling, no bracing. The way a person drops when the connection between brain and body is severed faster than the body can respond to it. He was on his back. Blood spread across the dry, pale soil rapidly. Splinters from the warped plywood had scattered in a radius of roughly 15 feet. The spinning frame was still partially powered for a few seconds before shutting down on its own. Witnesses later described standing there for several seconds before anyone moved, long enough that one of the friends closest to him said he believed for a moment that Rashad would get up. He did not. 2 friends began CPR within minutes. A third ran to the street and flagged down a nearby resident who contacted the local emergency rescue service by phone. Responders arrived on scene in approximately 15 minutes. Rashad was unresponsive when they reached him and did not recover. The coroner's report identified the cause of death as severe closed head trauma with a depressed skull fracture. The part I keep returning to is the welding course registration, the fee already paid, logged in his phone the week before. He had a plan beyond that lot, and I don't think any of the friends standing there that afternoon understood what they had actually built until it was too late for the understanding to mean anything.
It was March 14th, 2016, on a mountain highway descending through the mountains of northern Colorado. The evening was cold and clear, and temperatures in the mountains had begun dropping quickly after sunset. Jake Merritt, 26, worked as a freight coordinator for a logistics company in Kansas City, Missouri. He had organized the trip for himself and 4 friends. The group had spent the afternoon hiking a high-altitude trail climbing above 10,000 feet, accessible from a popular trailhead. Jake had completed the same trail twice before and was familiar with the route. He also had driven mountain roads before and considered himself comfortable behind the wheel in difficult conditions. He volunteered to drive the rental van down the mountain when the group returned to the trailhead at dusk. No one objected. He was the most experienced driver in the group and had made the same offer on previous trips. The descent from the mountain range follows a narrow 2-lane road with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other. The road includes several sharp curves and a sustained downhill grade for several miles. The posted speed limit on the descent is 25 miles per hour in sections. Visibility after dark is limited. The group had stayed on the trail longer than planned. By the time they reached the van and began the drive down, the sun had fully set and the road ahead was lit only by headlights. Jake was driving. One passenger sat in the front seat while the other 3 were seated behind. The passengers were talking among themselves about the day's hike and the drive home, and did not immediately notice that Jake was beginning to struggle with the vehicle. The group had been on the road for approximately 15 minutes when Jake pressed the brake pedal and felt the van slow less than expected. He pressed harder, but the vehicle did not reduce speed at the normal rate. The van was traveling at an estimated 35 to 40 miles per hour, and approaching a sharp left curve with a guardrail and a significant drop beyond it. Instead of attempting to steer through the curve or continue braking, Jake made a sudden decision. Jake opened the driver's door and jumped from the moving van. With no one controlling the wheel, the vehicle immediately began drifting toward the outside edge of the lane. The passenger in the front seat initially froze, shocked by what had just happened. Then he lunged across the center console, grabbing the steering wheel as the vehicle drifted toward the edge of the lane. He climbed partially into the driver's position and pumped the brake pedal repeatedly until the van slowed and came to a stop on the shoulder roughly 200 feet down the road. The remaining passengers were uninjured, and the van sustained no significant damage. The passengers exited the vehicle and walked back up the road. They found Jake lying on the shoulder near the point where he had exited the vehicle. He had struck the road surface at an estimated 35 to 40 miles per hour. Emergency services were contacted at approximately 9:20 in the evening. A medical helicopter from a regional trauma center was dispatched shortly after. Jake was airlifted from the scene. He was pronounced dead the following morning. The cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained upon impact with the road surface after exiting a moving vehicle. Investigators later confirmed that the van's braking system showed no mechanical failure. The remaining passengers were interviewed by authorities and later arranged transportation away from the scene after it was cleared. The incident occurred during their drive down the mountain along the dark highway. It was August 6, 2013, on Interstate 80 westbound near Vacaville, California. Afternoon rush traffic filled the highway as cars and freight trucks crept forward through dense congestion. Along the right edge of the road, a narrow shoulder ran beside the lane, marked clearly for emergency use only. Heather Lawson, 46, worked as a medical billing clerk and followed the same highway commute home nearly every weekday. Co-workers described her as organized at work but easily irritated outside the office, especially during her drive home through crowded traffic. Public records showed several speeding citations over the previous decade. Friends later said she often complained about other drivers and believed people on the road slowed her down on purpose. That afternoon, Heather stopped at a fast food drive-thru before leaving the shopping area near Vacaville. As she pulled onto the highway and opened the bag at a red light, she noticed her burger came with only one small ketchup packet. Witnesses later recalled seeing her throw the bag onto the passenger seat while gesturing in frustration as traffic ahead slowed. By the time she merged onto Interstate 80, rush hour congestion had already formed. Vehicles moved only a few car lengths at a time before stopping again. Drivers waited patiently as the line crept forward, but Heather repeatedly closed gaps between cars and sounded her horn. Witnesses later said Heather began weaving within her lane while searching for a way around the traffic ahead. When vehicles slowed again near the Cherry Glen Road area, she steered onto the narrow shoulder despite signs clearly stating it was for emergencies only. Dust lifted from the gravel as her sedan accelerated quickly along the shoulder, passing rows of slow-moving vehicles, while traffic in the travel lanes barely moved. About half a mile ahead, a highway patrol officer had stopped on the shoulder to assist another vehicle. When he saw the sedan approaching rapidly along the emergency lane, the officer stood beside his patrol car and signaled for the driver to stop. Heather slowed briefly and pulled alongside the patrol car. Witnesses later told investigators that she leaned toward the officer and said she needed to get through because she was pregnant and feeling sick. As the officer stepped toward the driver's window from beside the patrol car, Heather suddenly accelerated and continued driving along the shoulder. The officer returned to his patrol car and activated his lights and siren while traffic ahead remained heavy, leaving little space for vehicles to merge between lanes. After several seconds on the shoulder, Heather tried forcing her way back into the right lane between two cars creeping forward in slow traffic. Her tires struck the loose gravel beyond the shoulder line, causing the sedan to lose traction and slide sideways across the lane. Drivers braked sharply as the car spun across two lanes of traffic, striking the metal guardrail before rebounding across the roadway and slamming into the concrete median barrier, where the airbags deployed and the vehicle came to a stop. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic slowed around the crash site. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation on the roadway, but were unable to restore circulation. The coroner later determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head and chest from the high-speed impacts. Investigators documented tire marks along the shoulder and gravel scuffs where traction had failed. Witnesses confirmed the sedan had driven along the emergency lane before the crash. It was June 18th, 2016, on a calm summer evening at a popular lakeside marina in Northern California. The water was smooth near the docks, and the area remained active with recreational boat traffic returning ahead of sunset. Wooden docks extended into open water, with pilings rising above the surface to support slips used by rental boats and private vessels. Dexter Vunt was 28 years old and worked as a mechanic at a local repair shop. Friends described him as careful and methodical in his work. but less experienced with activities outside his routine. He had been dating his girlfriend for 2 years and planned the evening as a surprise proposal. Wanting a scenic setting, he rented a canoe from the marina and chose a spot near the dock where friends could watch and record the moment. Dexter had limited experience operating small watercraft. The rental staff provided basic instructions and life jackets, but he chose not to wear one, believing the calm water and proximity to the dock made it unnecessary. He loaded the canoe with a small picnic setup and paddled out slowly, keeping close to the dock so his friends could see clearly. As the canoe drifted alongside the dock, Dexter steadied it with a single paddle while positioning himself to propose. His friends gathered above him, phones raised, waiting for the moment. The canoe floated parallel to the dock, separated by only a few feet of water. Nearby, a motorboat passed through the marina channel, sending a series of wakes toward the dock area. The first wave rocked the canoe, shifting it sideways. Dexter adjusted his stance, trying to keep the canoe aligned. The second wave arrived moments later, pushing the canoe closer to the dock and toward one of the supporting pilings. The canoe struck the piling and jolted sharply. Dexter lost his balance and was thrown sideways into the narrow space between the canoe and the dock structure. The canoe pressed against him as additional waves arrived, pinning him briefly against the piling. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and forced his upper body underwater. Friends on the dock shouted and rushed toward the edge as the canoe shifted again. Dexter struggled to free himself, but the unstable canoe continued to bump against the piling. Within seconds, he slipped beneath the surface, disoriented and unable to regain control. By the time the canoe drifted clear, he was no longer visible above the water. Several friends jumped in immediately while others called for emergency assistance. They pulled Dexter from the water and brought him onto the dock. He was unresponsive and not breathing. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward and attempted resuscitation, but his condition did not improve. Dexter Vunt was pronounced dead after being transported for medical evaluation. The cause of death was determined to be drowning following blunt force trauma sustained during the collision with the dock structure. Investigators concluded the incident was accidental, caused by a combination of boat wake, close positioning to fixed structures, and the decision to stage a proposal from an unstable watercraft without protective equipment. The proposal never happened. What was meant to be a carefully planned surprise ended instead with a fatal outcome, driven by a single decision to turn a public dock and open water into a stage for the moment.
It was September 3rd, 2017, in a second-floor apartment in Osaka's Tennoji ward. What happened on the narrow stairwell landing that evening didn't begin with violence, but with a cat's face and a young man who refused to hear a single no. Hiro Tanaka was 22, a part-time worker at a neighborhood cafe where he handled the morning pastry shift. Co-workers described him as eager to please but impatient, the kind of person who cut corners and called it efficiency. He had no documented conflicts, but a habit of pushing small boundaries. His goal that evening was simple: get a funny photo for his social media feed. He had come to his friend's apartment to hang out, and the rescue cat, a blocky, flat-faced animal with a permanently furrowed brow, looked like a viral moment waiting to happen. I think the warning signs were there for anyone who wanted to see them. You have to understand that this specific pet is a rescue. The cat had arrived at the apartment only 3 weeks earlier, still hiding under furniture whenever someone moved too fast. The friend explicitly told Hiro not to approach the animal, but Hiro figured one quick photo wouldn't hurt. That kind of thinking, the belief that consequences apply to other people, is what makes these stories feel inevitable. That evening, the cat had wedged itself under a wooden chair near the kitchen, watching. Then a delivery arrived, a cardboard box at the front door. The friend went to sign for it, distracted for less than 2 minutes. That was the opening. The security camera, mounted in the hallway corner, recorded what followed. Hiro rose from the couch and walked toward the cat. The cat flattened its ears and lowered its body, retreating backward toward the stairwell. Hiro followed. The cat climbed up the stairs and stopped, its posture stiff. Hiro reached down. A cat person will see all the signs and would probably leave it alone. There's so many times the cat tried to communicate discomfort as Hiro forced the interaction. I don't think Hiro is appreciative of cats. He's just doing it for the likes. The footage shows the animal's head turned toward the upper landing. It wanted to run, but Hero's hand closed around its midsection first. He lifted the cat to chest height, phone in his other hand, thumb already opening the camera app for his selfie. The cat struggled, hind legs kicking, claws catching fabric. Then it raked his right cheek hard and twisted free. Hero flinched backward, his left heel missing the landing edge by inches. The phone flew from his hand and clattered down the steps. His right arm swung out for the wall, but found nothing. He fell sideways, his temple catching the concrete edge of the second step with a sound the friend later described as a thick, deadened knock, like a hammer wrapped in a towel. His body tumbled once, twice, and came to rest at the bottom landing. Limbs splayed. The cat scrambled up the stairs and out of frame. The friend heard the impact from the front doorway, the initial crack, then the slower thud of a body rolling. He called out Hero's name. No answer. He ran to the stairwell and found Hero face down on the concrete, a dark pool spreading beneath his temple. He called emergency services immediately. Responders arrived and Hero was unconscious, breathing in short, irregular gasps. He was transported to a regional hospital, but never regained consciousness. The coroner's findings, in plain terms, listed cause of death as acute subdural hematoma from blunt force head trauma, bleeding between the skull and brain following impact with a concrete stair edge. The cat was unharmed. A veterinarian later documented stress-related avoidance behavior consistent with recent relocation, hiding, flattened posture, retreat from approach. The friend, unable to keep the animal after what happened, returned it to the pound within a week. I don't blame the cat. Animals communicate discomfort clearly. Lowered bodies, pinned ears, retreat. Hero chose to ignore all of it. I think that's not a tragedy of bad luck. It's a tragedy of someone who decided a photo was worth more than a living creature's boundaries. And now the cat, through no fault of its own, has lost its second home.
It was May 10th, 2016, and Tucson, Arizona was already running hot. Daytime temperatures in the desert push well past 95 degrees by midday in late spring. And on this particular afternoon, the air was dry and still. The kind of conditions that bake everything outdoors and push most people inside. The shed at the back of the property sat in partial shade, but that meant little. What was inside it hadn't changed. Christina Zorn was 52 years old. She worked in property management, a role that kept her in constant contact with maintenance issues and the question of when to call a professional and when to handle something herself. By her neighbors' accounts, she leaned heavily toward the latter. She trusted her own read on a situation. That confidence wasn't always wrong, but it made her slow to accept advice she hadn't asked for. The hive had been building inside the shed long enough that more than one neighbor raised a concern and encouraged her to contact a licensed removal service. She wasn't interested. She looked at the hive, decided it was manageable, and came back from a local supply store with an over-the-counter insecticide. What she dismissed was the environment itself. Tucson sits well within the range of Africanized honeybees, a population documented across the Southwest, known for a faster and more sustained defensive response than other varieties. High midday temperatures increase colony activity and aggression. This hive wasn't isolated. It sat near a fenced yard where neighboring children regularly played. They were outside that afternoon, at a distance. She set up a ladder alongside the shed, climbed up with the insecticide, and began spraying the hive directly. She had no protective gear, no face covering, no gloves, no long sleeves. Nothing between her skin and the colony. The response was immediate. A large number of bees emerged and began stinging. The areas hit first were her face, neck, and arms, all exposed, all unprotected from the start. The natural response in that situation is to get down and move away. She didn't. She kept spraying, which extended her time in the swarm and prolonged the disturbance to the colony. The stings continued to accumulate. At some point, she dropped the can and lost her footing, coming down hard at the base of the shed. I don't know why I fixate on her hands, but I do. My own mother was the same way, always had to finish what she started, even when it was clearly going wrong. I'd watch her struggle with jammed windows, burnt cookies, broken vacuum cleaners, never asking for help. The fall wasn't from a dangerous height on its own, but the swarm didn't stop when she landed. Witnesses in the yard next door reported the bees continuing to attack for a period before gradually dispersing. The mechanism that kills in mass envenomation cases isn't always an allergic reaction, it's volume. Hundreds of stings introduce enough venom to overwhelm the body's ability to process it. Organ function deteriorates, circulation is disrupted, it builds, and by the time the outward signs are visible, it's already underway. By the time she stopped moving, the swarm had largely dispersed. Neighbors moved the children indoors and called emergency services. Responders arrived to find Christina unresponsive at the base of the ladder. The spray can was on the ground nearby. The hive was still active above. She was confirmed deceased at the scene. The official cause of death was toxic envenomation, mass stinging resulting in systemic venom overload that disrupted organ function beyond the point of recovery. Investigators confirmed that multiple neighbors had warned her and recommended a licensed removal service before the attempt. The insecticide was later noted as inadequate for a colony of that size and species. No protective equipment was found at the scene. The hive was removed days later by a licensed pest control team in full protective gear, the same option available to her before any of this started. It was May 3, 2016, at a roadside fuel station on the eastern outskirts of Jaipur, India. A strip of cracked asphalt between tea stalls and idle auto rickshaws where the evening heat sat unmoving and where one man's refusal to be corrected in front of strangers was about to cost both him and his wife everything they had. Raghav Sethi was 32 years old and worked as a daily wage construction laborer in Jaipur. He poured concrete, hauled rebar, and picked up extra shifts whenever the foreman offered them, because the money was never quite enough for the apartment he shared with his wife Mira and their 5-year-old son in one of the city's lower-income districts. That evening, they were on their way back home after he had finished a late shift, planning to pick up food along the way because their son had been asking for something sweet. People who knew him described him as stubborn, but I think not in a calculating way, but in the specific way of a man with limited power in most areas of his life, who made a point of not surrendering what small amounts he did have. He was the kind of person who made things worse by digging in, and this incident just proves it. He arrived at the station on his battered motorcycle that evening, with Mira seated directly behind him. A half-smoked cigarette was still burning between his fingers when he pulled alongside the pump. The attendant had already opened the fuel cap in preparation to start filling and noticed immediately, moving toward him, shouting. A bystander later told investigators the attendant was not subtle. He pointed directly at the cigarette and raised his voice clearly. Raghav did not dismount. Witnesses described him arguing back and gesturing broadly while the cigarette continued to burn in his hand. The attendant stepped closer, his voice sharper now, motioning toward the pump and then at the ground, as if urging him to put it out immediately. Raghav shook his head and said something back that several people described as dismissive. Raghav leaned slightly forward over the tank as the attendant continued speaking. The two of them now locked in a back and forth that drew everyone's attention. Mira remained seated behind him. The attendant gestured again, more urgently this time, pointing directly at the cigarette. Witnesses said Raghav flicked the cigarette in a dismissive gesture toward the tank opening, and the ember landed among the rising gasoline vapors, igniting them almost instantly. Whether it was deliberate provocation or recklessness, no one present could say with certainty. But what I do know is that the ignition was instantaneous. There was a low, concussive thump. Multiple witnesses used that exact description independently, followed immediately by fire spreading across the fuel pooled on the concrete beneath the motorcycle. Raghav's synthetic work shirt, the kind sold cheaply at any market stall, did not burn away from his body. It fused into the tissue beneath it within the first few seconds of contact. Mira's clothing caught from the rear of the motorcycle, fire moving up her back before she could react or flail her arms in an attempt to escape. I want to be clear about what that means physically. Synthetic fabric in direct contact with open flame doesn't give you time. It is already over before your body has registered what's happening. Bystanders moved toward them almost immediately. Several grabbed water buckets kept near the station wash area. Others used cloth. The fire had already taken deep hold before anyone reached them. Witnesses dragged both victims away from the motorcycle onto the open road surface. Burning fuel on the concrete continued to feed the fire even after both of them had been pulled clear of the bike. Raghav's face and hands bore the worst of the initial flash exposure. Mira's back and left arm were described by responding personnel as consistent with sustained flame contact. One shopkeeper who witnessed the entire sequence told investigators the screaming had stopped before emergency services arrived. In burn cases of this severity, that is not a sign of improvement. A fire unit and ambulance arrived approximately 8 minutes later. Both were pronounced dead before transport. The medical examiner's findings indicated full-thickness burns covering more than 85% of total body surface area in both individuals. Their son was 5 years old. He was left in the care of Raghav's elderly parents. Neighbors reported seeing him in the days that followed, moving quietly around the apartment building without apparent understanding of what had occurred. What Raghav did that evening was never going to hurt only himself. Mira was sitting directly behind him, and she had not argued with the attendant once. That is the part of this story that I cannot move past, and I don't think I should.
It was August 19th, 2017. In Chicago, Illinois. The night was humid and still, and the city below the 12th floor was quiet, except for the low movement of late traffic along the street. Marcus Holt, 34, worked as a regional sales representative for a medical supply company. Renee Holt, 31, had worked as a dental hygienist before taking time away following a difficult pregnancy, and had recently returned to part-time work at a clinic in Lincoln Park. The two had been married for 4 years and lived together in a 12-story residential building in Chicago. Neighbors later described the couple as generally quiet, though arguments inside the apartment had occasionally been heard in the past. Their unit included a small exterior balcony overlooking the street. The balcony railing stood approximately 4 feet high. Below it, a bundle of utility service cables ran along the exterior of the building between the 8th and 9th floors, supporting communication and service lines connected to the surrounding block. The argument began inside the apartment sometime after 11 in the evening. It escalated quickly and continued for roughly 30 minutes before the couple moved outside onto the balcony. 12 stories below them, the street was visible through the railing. Neither slowed down. The argument intensified. Marcus shoved Renee with both hands. She stumbled backward into the railing, her upper body tipping over before she could recover, and she went over the edge. A bundle of utility service cables mounted along the exterior of the building caught her partway down. The lines sagged sharply under her weight, leaving her tangled and suspended several floors above the street. She was conscious and calling out, but unable to free herself. Marcus looked over the railing and saw her suspended several floors below. The cables had stopped her fall between the 8th and 9th floors. From where he stood on the 12th floor balcony, she was still several stories beneath him. At that point, emergency services could have been contacted for a rescue from below. Instead, Marcus climbed over the railing of the 12th floor balcony with no harness, no rope, no anchor point, and no equipment of any kind. Holding the outer ledge of the balcony, he attempted to lower himself down the exterior wall of the building toward the cables several floors below where Renee was tangled. He lost his grip almost immediately. Marcus fell past the cables without catching them and dropped the full remaining distance to the pavement below the building. Residents on a 9th floor balcony heard Renee calling out and came outside. The cables ran close enough to the building that they were able to reach her and pull her through the railing to safety before emergency services arrived. She was conscious when paramedics reached her and was transported to a hospital, where she was treated for a broken collarbone, lacerations to both arms, and injuries to her right leg. She was admitted in stable condition. Marcus Holt was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma resulting from a fall from height. Investigators reviewed the physical evidence and determined that Marcus had pushed Renee over the railing before attempting to climb down the exterior of the building to reach her. No charges were filed against Renee. She survived the incident and later provided a statement to authorities about the events on the balcony. It was May 3rd, 2016 in Austin, Texas, northbound on Interstate 35 near the Palmer Lane construction corridor. Afternoon heat hung over narrowed lanes where concrete barriers pressed tight to the stripe. A loaded cement mixer moved within the speed limit ahead. The unfinished shoulder was loose gravel, leaving little room to correct if a vehicle left the lane. Angela Rudd, 51, worked as a regional retail supervisor who spent most weeks driving between stores from Round Rock to South Austin. Her days ran on mileage, inspections, and quick stops between locations. Friends said she often complained about delays on the road. Co-workers noticed she followed cars closely, tapped the horn quickly, and showed little patience for slow merges. Her messages at work were short and focused on cutting time from store visits. She drove a 2014 Ford Explorer used for store inspections, usually carrying paperwork and display materials in the back. That afternoon, she headed north toward inspections near the Palmer Lane work zone, where construction narrowed 3 lanes to 2. Concrete barriers tightened the roadway, and the shoulder beside them was unfinished gravel marked off by cones and warning signs. Traffic slowed as vehicles approached the lane shift. The cement mixer ahead maintained a steady pace between 30 and 35 miles per hour, consistent with the posted limit through the construction area. Angela's SUV closed tightly behind the truck. Witnesses later said she leaned forward toward the windshield and sounded the horn repeatedly as the line of vehicles continued at the reduced speed. As traffic slowed further at the lane transition, drivers remained in line behind the cement mixer moving through the work zone. Several witnesses later reported that Angela's SUV suddenly moved right, crossing past the temporary cones that marked the shoulder as closed. The Explorer accelerated onto the gravel shoulder, attempting to pass the cement mixer along the construction edge of the roadway. The shoulder surface was uneven and loose. As the SUV accelerated along the gravel shoulder, dust rose behind the vehicle while the tires bounced across deep ruts left by construction equipment. Witnesses saw the Explorer drifting closer to the concrete barrier segments that lined the edge of the narrowed roadway. The right front tire struck the angled base of one of the temporary barrier sections, forcing the steering sharply left. The SUV rotated sideways and tipped onto the driver's side, sliding across the pavement toward the lane where the cement mixer was traveling. The truck driver applied the brakes immediately, but the heavy vehicle had only a short distance to react in the narrowed lane. The front of the mixer struck the overturned SUV and pushed it several feet before both vehicles came to a stop in the narrowed lane. Emergency services were called immediately as traffic halted while responders secured both vehicles. Angela was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported fatal crushing injuries after the truck pressed into the driver's side of the overturned SUV, collapsing the cabin. Investigators documented tire tracks along the gravel shoulder and barrier impacts. Witnesses said the SUV left the lane to pass on the construction shoulder. The reconstruction concluded the crash resulted from an illegal pass in an active work zone. Lanes stayed closed for hours before reopening. It was August 12, 2016, on a downtown Denver rooftop overlooking the city skyline. The flat-topped building rose 6 stories above street level, its gravel surface broken by ventilation units and utility piping. Earlier that day, routine maintenance had activated the rooftop sprinkler system, leaving shallow pools of water scattered across the surface. By evening, the temperature hovered around 72 degrees under clear skies. Marco Smith, 32, worked in marketing and had been planning a rooftop proposal for weeks. He wanted the moment to feel dramatic and memorable, choosing the rooftop for its view and privacy. His plan centered on a display of decorative string lights arranged to spell out, "Marry Me," designed to illuminate just as he knelt. Marco had no formal electrical training but relied on online tutorials and assumed the setup would be simple. The rooftop had no accessible power source, so Marco ran electricity from a ground floor outlet. He connected 4 extension cords end to end to reach the roof, exceeding manufacturer recommendations. The cords were designed for indoor use, not outdoor exposure. During setup, one cord developed a visible crack in its insulation after being stepped on repeatedly. Marco noticed the damage but continued assembling the display. A power strip was placed near the center of the arrangement, resting directly on the rooftop surface. Marco did not use ground fault circuit interrupter protection, and he did not elevate the connections above the wet gravel. By early evening, water from the sprinklers had pooled near the power strip and cable junctions. Elena Rodriguez arrived just before nightfall, guided to the rooftop by rose petals arranged along the stairwell. Friends and family positioned themselves nearby to record the proposal. Marco waited until Elena stood in the center of the rooftop display before activating the lights. As he reached down to connect the final plug, the power strip sat partially submerged in standing water. When Marco's fingers made contact with the wet plug, electrical current passed through the exposed wiring. His hand involuntarily clamped around the plug as muscle contraction locked his grip. His other hand, braced against the damp gravel, completed the electrical circuit through his torso. Witnesses saw Marco stiffen and collapse as the current disrupted his heart's rhythm. He fell backward onto the rooftop surface, unresponsive and not breathing. After several seconds, the electrical circuit was broken when the extension cord was pulled free. Marco remained unconscious. His heart had entered ventricular fibrillation, a lethal arrhythmia caused by electrical shock. Bystanders initiated emergency response measures while waiting for first responders. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Marco in cardiac arrest, with visible electrical burns on his hand and knee. Advanced life support measures continued on scene, including defibrillation attempts and airway management, but he could not be revived. He was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical examiner determined that Marco died from electrocution, resulting in fatal cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory arrest. The death was ruled accidental. Investigators identified multiple contributing hazards: indoor rated extension cords used outdoors, damaged insulation, excessive daisy chaining of power cords, an ungrounded power strip placed in standing water, and the absence of ground fault circuit protection. The rooftop lighting display never illuminated. The proposal never took place.
It was October 13th, 2018, on a friend's ranch in rural Alberta. Picture this: a quiet afternoon, a borrowed horse, and a man who just wanted to look interesting on dating apps. Now ask yourself what you'd give to have those 30 seconds back if you were him. Some doors close faster than you can blink. 31-year-old Kevin Laurent was single for 3 years after a relationship that fizzled without drama. According to friends, he spent his evenings cycling through 3 dating apps, swiping left and right in a rented apartment that stayed too tidy. I think loneliness is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It just hollows out the spaces between shifts. He had driven 2 hours to visit a friend from work, hoping to get some fresh air and, more urgently, fresh photos for his profile, which he explicitly told the friend. A few shots with a rustic backdrop, maybe a horse in the frame, to signal adventure and down-to-earth charm. I get it. His friend had warned him before he arrived. Stay clear of the hindquarters. Horses startle easy back there. Kevin nodded, acknowledged the advice, and then set it aside. He reasoned that a quick selfie, 30 seconds at most, couldn't possibly go wrong. He had seen similar photos online. People leaning against barns, patting muzzles, looking effortlessly rural. He did not understand that a horse's blind spot extends directly behind its tail, or that a human approaching from that angle with a phone raised could trigger a defensive, startled response rather than recognition. Additionally, and probably most importantly, I don't get why he's so into the horse's backside. Wouldn't most people want to have the face of the horse in a selfie? Anyway, Kevin's friend had stepped inside the stable to fetch a halter, leaving Kevin alone in the yard for less than a minute. That was all the time the situation needed. Based on what investigators pieced up, Kevin walked behind the horse, phone already in his hand, camera app open. He turned his back to the animal, extended his arm, and angled the phone for a rear-facing shot that would capture the horse's hindquarters. He did not know that the horse had stopped swishing its tail, and he definitely did not see the animal tense near the hips and shoulders. The friend stepped out in time to see Kevin airborne for a split second, his torso folding awkwardly as he was thrown backward from a horse's kick. The horse's hind leg had snapped outward in a fast kick, hoof connecting just below Kevin's left collarbone. The force drove him backward several feet into the fence line before his head struck a wooden fence post. A dull crack, then a second impact as the back of his skull hit the hard-packed ground. His body went limp before it stopped moving. I think the worst part is how fast it happens. 1 second you're framing a shot, the next your life is effectively over before you understand what happened. The friend ran. He later described Kevin's face as slack, eyes half open, a thin line of blood running from one ear. no chest rise that he could see. He called emergency services from his truck. The dispatcher sent ground EMS immediately, but the nearest hospital was 45 minutes away by road. An air ambulance was scrambled from Calgary. It landed in the pasture 18 minutes after the call. Paramedics worked on Kevin at the scene, then loaded him. He was pronounced dead at the Regional Trauma Center 2 hours later. The coroner's report, in plain terms, described catastrophic blunt force trauma to the upper chest, including multiple rib and sternal fractures with traumatic injury to the heart and major vessels, combined with a comminuted fracture of the occipital skull and severe traumatic brain injury. Kevin's funeral drew 14 people: his parents, a sister, a handful of co-workers, and the friend who watched it happen. No obituary ran beyond the local paper's brief notice. Look, I don't blame anyone for wanting to be loved. Desperation for connection makes people do unwise things. But next time you think to take a selfie with the horse, just go with its face, because some kicks don't give a second chance.
It was January 23, 2018, and Minneapolis was locked in the kind of winter that makes the whole city feel smaller. Temperatures had been fluctuating for weeks, freezing, then briefly thawing, then freezing again. That cycle is exactly what makes ice unpredictable. And it's what had been happening at a small neighborhood pond on the city's south side. The surface looked solid from the bank, but the signage at the water's edge told a different story. Kelly Spuff was 39. She worked in office administration, structured, routine-driven, used to things making sense. People who knew her said she pushed back when she felt she was being told what to do unnecessarily. She had the day off and went out for a walk to clear her head after a frustrating week, needing to feel in control of something small. She wasn't reckless in the usual sense, but when challenged, she had a tendency to push, to prove the point instead of stepping back. She arrived at the pond already in that mindset, looking for space, not a confrontation. The thin ice signs were clearly posted. A man nearby with 2 young children noticed her approaching the edge and warned her directly. He told her the ice wasn't safe. She paused, just long enough to register it, then kept going, like the warning didn't apply to her, like it was something she could personally assess and dismiss. Near the shoreline, the ice was white and opaque, the kind that looks solid. Further out, darker patches showed where it was thinner. Those patches weren't subtle. The man called out again, louder. Witnesses said her steps changed, more deliberate. It stopped looking like a walk and started looking like a decision she didn't want to walk back from. I've covered enough of these cases to know that a sign and a verbal warning together almost never change the outcome. Kelly had both, and neither was enough. She stepped past the sign and onto the ice. The surface held near the edge. She moved farther out, stomping as she went, testing it or making a point. It wasn't cautious. The stomping had a rhythm, exaggerated like she was proving something to the people watching. The cracking sound carried back to the bank. By then, the man had stopped warning and started pleading, telling her to come back, that his kids were watching. She kept going anyway, adding just a few more steps that made all the difference. She made it about 15 to 20 feet out before the surface gave way. The water was several feet deep. Cold shock is immediate. Gasping, rapid breathing, loss of control. She reached for the edge, trying to pull herself out, but the ice kept breaking under her grip, pushing solid ground farther away. The man found a long branch and extended it toward her, but he couldn't reach without risking the ice himself. He stayed at the edge and kept trying. Within minutes, cold incapacitation set in. Strength dropped. Coordination failed. Her movement slowed. What stands out is how fast it turned, from control to panic, from proving a point to fighting for seconds. With no time left to correct it, she was conscious and trying for a period that felt long to the people watching, and there was nothing they could do. By the time emergency services arrived, she had gone under. Responders recovered her from the water. She was unresponsive. Efforts to revive her failed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was cold water immersion, cold shock, incapacitation, then drowning. Investigators confirmed both signage and a direct warning had been present. The pond was temporarily closed. No changes to signage were recommended. It had been clear and correct. The warnings worked. They just weren't followed. It was May 15th, 2018, and a quiet, residential community built over volcanic terrain was coming apart in a way no one there had ever experienced. Streets had begun to split. Long cracks cut through yards and pavement. In multiple locations, molten rock had already surfaced, slow but unstoppable. The air carried a sharp sulfur sting, the kind that burned the throat and made breathing feel wrong if you stayed in it too long. What started as warnings had escalated into mandatory evacuation orders. Families packed quickly, cars filled driveways, then disappeared. Within days, the neighborhood emptied out. Zabby Grohl, 61, did not leave. At first, neighbors assumed she just needed more time, but as conditions worsened, her refusal started to stand out. When utility crews came through urging immediate evacuation, she didn't just decline, she pushed back. When officials explained the severity, she reportedly insisted she understood the risks better than they did. She framed it as control, as awareness, as being more capable than the people knocking on her door. She wasn't panicking like everyone else. She wasn't overreacting. This was her property, and she made it clear she wasn't going to be told what to do with it. By the time the last neighbors were leaving, some described a shift, not just attachment, but defiance. She was still outside, moving things around, monitoring the situation herself, acting as if the evacuation was optional guidance meant for other people. The same warnings everyone else heard, she filtered differently. In her mind, this wasn't an emergency she needed to obey. It was an inconvenience she intended to outlast. The ground had been changing for days. Cracks widened across roads and yards. Gas levels fluctuated. The smell in the air wasn't constant. Sometimes it faded just enough to feel manageable, reinforcing the idea that the situation was under control. She continued working outside in that environment, adjusting belongings, staying active, staying present, as if visibility meant safety. Then a new fissure opened nearby. With it came a surge in volcanic gas output, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide pushing up from underground. The terrain wasn't flat or predictable. It dipped, pocketed, and uneven lava formations created natural low points where gases could settle. Carbon dioxide, heavier than air, collected silently in these areas, displacing oxygen without warning. Sulfur dioxide lingered as an irritant, burning, choking, forcing the body into distress. There isn't always smoke. There isn't always a visible cue, and by the time symptoms start, the body is already losing the ability to respond. She was outside when conditions shifted. Exposure at that level doesn't unfold slowly. Carbon dioxide reduces available oxygen, leading to dizziness, confusion, then rapid loss of consciousness. At the same time, sulfur dioxide inflames the lungs, triggering coughing, panic, and impaired breathing. Together, they create a narrowing window, seconds to minutes, where awareness slips before a person fully processes what's happening. There were no witnesses. What investigators later reconstructed came from position, gas measurements, and eruption timelines. She collapsed on her own property. What stays with me isn't just that she stayed. It's how firmly she believed she was the exception. The orders were clear. The risk was visible. People had already proven what the right decision looked like by leaving. But somewhere in that progression, she placed her judgment above all of it. Above officials, above neighbors, above the environment itself. By the time responders could safely return, she was unresponsive. She was found where she had chosen to remain. The cause of death was hazardous gas exposure, oxygen displacement from carbon dioxide accumulation in a low-lying area compounded by respiratory distress from sulfur dioxide during active fissure emissions. The evacuation order had been documented. The advisories had been repeated. The conditions had been escalating in plain sight, and still, she stayed. Zabby's case changes the way the pattern reads. Every danger before this feels external, something advancing, something you can step away from. But here, the threat didn't need to chase her. It didn't need speed or force. It only required one decision to stand still and believe the rules didn't apply. That's what makes it different. Because the most dangerous factor in that entire environment wasn't just the gas rising from the ground. It was the certainty that she didn't have to listen. It was June 22, 2015, on the Skagerrak coastline in Västra Götaland County, Sweden, where the North Sea grinds against gneiss shelves that have been fracturing quietly for centuries, long before anyone thought to stand on the edge of them. Emmerich Das was 28 years old and worked part-time at a regional print studio. Photography was what actually occupied him. Coastal landscapes mostly, overcast water and granite shelves shot in flat morning light. His friends described him as someone who prioritized proximity to his subject over everything else. Based on what I've read, he had a consistent habit of deciding that closer was always better than safer. The trip to the Skagerrak coast had been his idea. He had identified the location through satellite imagery and wanted wide-angle shots of the water from the edge. He brought 2 camera bodies and a tripod. The tripod had been positioned on the stable portion of the ledge, but one camera rested precariously on the edge of the slab. His 3 friends came along the way people do when someone they like is enthusiastic, without strong opinions of their own. There was no formal trail to the ledge. They scrambled over loose fieldstone for roughly a quarter mile from the nearest parking area before reaching the edge. No barriers, ropes, or warning markers existed before the accident, as this stretch was considered informal and seldom patrolled. The group reached the edge in late morning. Emmerich shot for roughly 40 minutes before noticing a large detached slab near the lip, approximately 6 feet across and visibly separated from the shelf beneath it on one side. One friend later told investigators the gap was obvious once you looked for it, and that the ground immediately surrounding the slab felt different underfoot, less resistant, slightly yielding. Emmerich registered this. One of them pointed out the gap again, but no one stepped back. After a brief pause, giggling at the precariousness, and on a sudden impulse, they collectively decided to push it for fun, neither fully registering the risk. The group began pushing the slab toward the edge anyway. The slab moved after several seconds of combined effort. That part went as expected. What followed did not. The section of ledge beneath the slab had already fractured along a horizontal plane, and the lateral force was enough to complete the separation. A roughly 10-foot section of the outer lip dropped. Emmerich was standing directly on it. I've read enough of these to know that the ground feeling wrong and continuing anyway is its own kind of decision. He did not fall clean. He tumbled with the collapsing slab, arms flailing briefly as he struck jagged edges. His 3 friends were close enough to feel the vibration through the soles of their boots before they scrambled back from the new edge. One of them described to investigators seeing Emmerich's shoulders drop below the ledge line as the rock face came apart around him. Dust rose immediately, and smaller rock fragments skittered down, some bouncing off the shelf below before settling. The drop was approximately 60 feet onto a broken rock shelf above the waterline. The geology of the shelf meant there was no soil or sand to absorb any part of what arrived, only fractured gneiss, uneven and angled toward the water. The 3 friends reached the new edge within seconds of the collapse. Nothing below was moving. One of them called Regional Emergency Services immediately. A Coast Guard unit arrived by water within 25 minutes. Emmerich was confirmed dead at the scene. The coroner's report determined cause of death to be massive blunt force trauma from a fall of approximately 60 feet, combined with impact from descending rock debris. Findings included open skull fracture, complete disruption of the thoracic cavity, bilateral rib fractures, traumatic aortic rupture, and comminuted fractures of both lower extremities. Examination also showed multiple abrasions and contusions from sliding across jagged rock before impact. Death was not survivable and was likely near instantaneous at the moment of impact. Regional authorities placed warning markers at the cliff access point within the week. Local news covered it briefly, framing it as a regional cautionary item. No memorial was placed at the site per the family's wishes. Emmerich's friends gave statements to investigators and did not return. So, the ground already felt wrong before they started pushing, and everyone standing there knew it. The decision to continue anyway isn't something I can fully explain, and I'm not sure the people who were there can either.
It was October 8th, 2016, in Phoenix, Arizona. The convention hall was filled by mid-morning, families moving between vendor booths, while overhead lights reflected off glass terrariums and aquarium panels lining the aisles. Edward Cahill, 37, worked as a logistics coordinator for a freight company based in Tempe. He had shown up at the Pet Expo alone on his day off. Colleagues who later spoke to investigators said he was always the first to volunteer for any kind of challenge at work events, and that he treated competitions of any kind as something he was unlikely to lose. He had come specifically for the contest advertised on the expo floor map. The booth belonged to a small Phoenix reptile shop. A handwritten sign at the booth indicated it was an insect-eating contest with a ball python as the prize. At the back of the table, a juvenile ball python sat coiled inside a glass terrarium under a ceramic heat lamp. The booth staff explained the contest format. Insects were pre-portioned into small cups, each cup representing 1 point. Staff would tally cups consumed within 5 minutes. Whoever finished the most cups won the snake. The available portions included mealworms, superworms, and darkling beetles, all edible species commonly used in reptile feeding and cleared for human consumption under the booth's promotional permit. At the far end of the table, set apart from the others, sat a sealed jar containing a small honeycomb section, with live bees still moving inside it. A card in front of it read that it was a bonus round worth double points, noting that the honeycomb may contain live bees and that any competitor who attempted the bonus round did so at their own risk. 6 people entered. A waiver was placed in front of Edward. He signed it without reading it. When the timer started, participants worked through their pre-portioned cups. 2 slowed within the first minute, setting cups down and stepping back from the table. A third lasted 2 minutes before dropping out entirely. The staff member tracked counts on a whiteboard. Edward did not slow down. He moved through cup after cup without hesitation, his count climbing well above everyone else remaining at the table. The ball python had not moved from its position beneath the heat lamp. When the final 60 seconds were called, the staff member unsealed the bonus jar. The buzz from inside was audible across the booth. The 2 remaining competitors looked at the jar and stepped back. Edward was already ahead by enough to win without it. The result was not in doubt. However, he reached forward and took the jar anyway. He bit into the comb. A bee stung him on the interior of his lower lip as his teeth broke through the wax. When time expired, the result was announced. Edward had consumed more than any other competitor by a wide margin. Applause came from the back of the crowd. The staff member moved toward the terrarium. Edward coughed once, then again harder. He set a hand flat on the table and swallowed with visible effort. Someone near the front of the crowd asked if he was all right. He did not respond. His lips had begun to swell and his breathing had become audible from several feet away. A woman beside him said he was choking. Someone else laughed, assuming it was a reaction to the insects. Then his legs gave way and he went down against the side of the table. Expo staff called for emergency services immediately. 2 paramedics already stationed inside the convention hall reached the booth within 3 minutes and found Edward unresponsive on the floor. Treatment was administered on site before he was transported by ambulance. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as anaphylaxis triggered by bee venom. Edward had already secured the highest count in the contest before attempting the bonus round. Event organizers later removed the live bee portion from the contest format following the incident. The ball python remained inside its terrarium at the back of the booth, still coiled beneath the heat lamp. It was March 12, 2018, on Route 17 northbound in Paramus, New Jersey. The afternoon was clear and dry, as steady weekend traffic moved between shopping centers and highway entrances. Delivery trucks and dump trucks traveled through the corridor, while brake lights rippled across the lanes as vehicles slowed and accelerated through merging traffic. Monica Hale, 45, worked as a dental receptionist in Paramus. Co-workers described her as organized but quick to lose patience when schedules changed or people slowed things down. Much of her routine centered around her daily commute, and her sedan had a phone mounted to the windshield, where she sometimes recorded short clips of traffic while talking about drivers she believed were careless or aggressive. Friends later said Monica often complained that other vehicles were following too closely behind her. Even in normal traffic, she sometimes believed certain drivers were deliberately staying near her car. In the weeks before the crash, she had mentioned several trucks that she believed had followed her along different routes during her commute, suspicions that often appeared in the short videos she recorded from inside her vehicle. That afternoon, Monica drove northbound along Route 17 Heading home after work, traffic was moderately heavy as vehicles moved between retail exits and merging lanes near Paramus Road. A loaded dump truck carrying gravel entered the same lane behind her sedan after merging from a side road. Witnesses later said Monica began checking her rearview mirror repeatedly while pointing toward the truck behind her. At several points, she slowed sharply before accelerating again, forcing the truck driver to brake as traffic compressed around them. Drivers nearby reported seeing Monica gesturing in her mirror and shaking her head while looking back at the truck. Each time the sedan slowed, the dump truck driver reduced speed and attempted to increase distance. However, vehicles in the adjacent lanes limited how far the truck could move. Traffic beside the truck prevented it from shifting lanes while the flow of cars continued through the corridor. As the vehicles approached a slight bend near an overpass, Monica's sedan slowed again. Witnesses described her braking abruptly while looking back toward the truck behind her. The car's brake lights illuminated as its speed dropped quickly in front of the larger vehicle. The dump truck driver applied the brakes immediately. The truck's air braking system engaged as the heavy vehicle slowed under the weight of its gravel load. A loaded dump truck weighs several times more than a passenger car and requires significantly more distance to stop. With limited space ahead and no open lane to move into, the truck continued closing the remaining distance. The front bumper of the truck struck the rear of Monica's sedan. The impact pushed the smaller vehicle forward several yards before both vehicles came to a stop in the lane. The rear of the sedan collapsed inward as surrounding traffic slowed, and drivers steered around the crash. Emergency services arrived within minutes as police secured the roadway, and paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but Monica was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt force injuries to the head, neck, and chest, consistent with a high-energy rear-end collision. Investigators documented skid marks, vehicle positions, and statements from drivers who witnessed the crash. Witnesses reported that the sedan had slowed suddenly several times before the collision. Investigators later concluded that repeated sudden braking in dense traffic contributed to the crash. The dump truck driver remained at the scene and cooperated with authorities, who determined he attempted to brake but did not have enough distance to stop the loaded vehicle. No charges were filed. It was October 9th, 2015, as a sunrise hot air balloon flight lifted above the high desert landscape outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. The launch occurred under clear skies with light winds and cool morning temperatures. The balloon's wicker basket carried a pilot and 2 passengers, suspended beneath a nylon envelope fed by a propane burner mounted above the basket's frame. Leda Twigg, 34, an elementary school teacher, had joined the flight believing it was a routine sightseeing excursion. Unbeknownst to her, her boyfriend, John Hallow, 29, had planned to propose during the flight. John had spent weeks preparing what he believed would be a memorable moment, convinced that the height and scenery would make the proposal unforgettable. Without informing the balloon operator, John brought small pyrotechnic devices aboard, assuming they were harmless sparklers. He concealed them among personal items in the basket, alongside flowers, a camera, and the engagement ring. Both passengers wore lightweight synthetic jackets suitable for the cool air, but not designed to withstand open flame. The pilot conducted a standard safety briefing before takeoff, instructing passengers to remain clear of the burner assembly and avoid introducing any open flames. The flight ascended smoothly, reaching several hundred feet above ground level, as the balloon drifted over open desert terrain. As the balloon stabilized in calm air, John decided the timing was right. He retrieved the concealed devices and positioned himself near Leda at the center of the basket. Without warning the pilot, he activated the pyrotechnics directly beneath the burner frame. The devices produced intense sparks and open flame, rather than the brief glow John expected. The flames rose toward the burner assembly, briefly contacting components near the fuel lines and heat shield. Almost immediately, the pilot noticed irregular burner behavior and a sudden change in flame response. At the same time, sparks ignited the synthetic material of John's jacket, and flames spread rapidly across his upper body. Leda attempted to move away as the confined space filled with heat and burning debris. The pilot shut off the burner and initiated an emergency descent, venting hot air to bring the balloon down as quickly as possible. As lift rapidly decreased, the balloon began descending faster than a normal landing profile. The envelope partially deflated, reducing stability and control. The basket rocked as it dropped toward the desert floor, its descent no longer smooth or predictable. The balloon struck the ground hard in an open field, the basket impacting uneven terrain. The force threw the occupants against the interior of the basket. John sustained severe trauma during the impact. Leda was also violently thrown, suffering catastrophic injuries from the abrupt landing. Emergency services were dispatched after ground observers reported smoke and a rapid descent. Paramedics reached the landing site within minutes and found both passengers unresponsive in the basket. Despite emergency medical efforts, both were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical investigator determined that both deaths resulted from blunt force trauma consistent with a high-energy impact during an uncontrolled landing. Burn injuries were present on John's upper body, but were not identified as the primary cause of death. The investigation concluded that the incident was accidental and directly caused by the unauthorized use of pyrotechnic devices inside the balloon basket. The ignition disrupted burner operation and forced an emergency descent that ended in a fatal impact. The proposal never took place.
It was December 15, 2013, in a suburb outside Columbus, where a porch light still strung with last year's Christmas decorations would become the last thing a 19-year-old saw before the concrete came up to meet her. Melissa Montemayor worked the register at a department store in a strip mall, the kind of job where she stood for 8 hours folding clearance sweaters and answering the same 4 questions. Friends from the store knew her as the one who showed up to the holiday party with peppermint bark and a spreadsheet of themed social media posts she wanted to shoot. That night, at a small house party in a split-level rental, she wanted to get one good selfie with the porch lights before the freezing drizzle moved in. The lights had been up since 2 previous Christmases, stored loose in a cardboard box in the garage. They worked when plugged in, casting a warm yellow glow across the railing. Melissa had done this before, wrapped lights around her neck for a photo, no different from a scarf. Her friends watched from the doorway, laughing. One pulled out a phone to film the setup. Another leaned against the doorframe holding a drink. Nobody checked the wire. The porch was narrow, maybe 6 feet across, with a metal railing painted white and chipping near the base. A security camera mounted above the doorframe recorded the entire thing at an angle. The night was cold, damp, with frost settling on the concrete steps. Melissa adjusted the lights around her collar, stepped toward the railing, and braced one hand against the metal to lean into a pose. I think about how many times I've grabbed a frayed phone charger and thought nothing of it. These lights had been stepped on, coiled wrong, dragged across concrete. Nobody looks at Christmas lights for damage. They just plug them in and expect them to work. The insulation near the plug had worn through, exposing 2 small sections of copper. When Melissa shifted her weight, the bare wire touched the metal railing, causing a brief arc against the damp metal. The circuit completed through her body for less than a second, just long enough for her to jerk backward involuntarily. The household breaker tripped a moment later as the damaged section of wire continued sparking against the railing. The porch went dark. One of her friends later told investigators it sounded like a sharp snap, followed by Melissa saying something short and startled, not even a word, just a noise. She lost her footing on the frost-slick concrete. Her left foot slipped off the edge of the porch step. Her right hand reached toward the railing but failed to get a grip before she lost balance completely. She fell sideways, turning slightly as she dropped, and the back of her head hit the edge of the bottom step first. The rest of her body followed onto the flat concrete pad below. The friend who had been filming dropped the phone and ran to her. Another called 911 immediately. The security camera footage showed the entire fall. Just over 1 second from the moment she jerked backward to the moment her head contacted the concrete. A third guest, who had training as a nursing assistant, checked for a pulse and found one, weak but present. She told the 911 operator Melissa was breathing but unresponsive. Paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. She was transported to a regional medical center where a CT scan revealed a significant epidural hematoma with associated skull fracture. Surgeons operated, but the bleed had progressed rapidly. She died hours later. The coroner later described the cause of death as blunt force head trauma from an accidental fall, with an electrical equipment malfunction identified as a contributing factor to the loss of balance. The house party ended immediately. The security footage was turned over to police and never released publicly. The friend who had been filming deleted the clip unprompted and told investigators she never wanted to see it again. Melissa's family requested no media coverage. I think the most honest thing I can say is that nobody in that doorway thought they were watching someone die. They thought they were watching a girl take a picture, and I think that's the part that follows them now. Not the fall, but the ordinary second before it, when everything still seemed fine. It was March 29th, 2017, on a steep residential hill in Sheffield, UK, where a shopping cart became a missile and a phone camera recorded the last clear moment of a teenager who thought speed was content. By the time the cart stopped, Liam Patel had already lost one of his sneakers during the fall. Liam Patel was 16, a Year 11 student known among his friends as the one who would try anything once. He had posted skateboard falls, stair jumps, and near misses across his social media for months. That Saturday afternoon, he and 3 friends found an abandoned shopping cart near a corner shop and decided to drag it to the steepest hill in the neighborhood. He was to stand inside the cart, film a fast ride selfie holding his phone outward, and post the video before dinner. I think a lot of teenagers have stood at the top of a hill with a dumb idea and called it fun. The problem isn't the idea. It's the absence of anyone old enough to say what happens when the curb wins. Before you judge his parents, Priya and Mark Patel, for neglect, it's worth noting that they were both senior nurses at a hospital, likely saving lives. They had spent Liam's entire adolescence exhausted, not neglectful, but absent in the way that financial necessity demands. Neither of them knew he had even left the house that afternoon. Liam had said he was going to a friend's to study. The hill dropped at roughly 20 degrees for about 300 feet. Narrow pavement bordered both sides, and metal signposts marked driveways at irregular intervals. The friends positioned the cart at the crest. Liam stepped inside, both feet planted, phone extended in his right hand, already recording the selfie. One friend started recording from the sidewalk. Another counted down. The cart began to roll. Initial speed was slow enough for laughter. Liam held his arms out, phone still filming. The cart picked up pace around the halfway point. The wheels started to wobble. One friend shouted something unintelligible. The cart drifted toward the left curb. Liam tried to shift his weight, but his stance inside the cart offered no leverage. The front wheel caught a raised curb. A driveway apron misaligned with the road surface by about 2 inches, causing a sudden deceleration and partial tip rather than a clean stop. The cart did not cleanly launch him forward. Instead, it rotated sharply and partially tipped, throwing him off balance. His chest and face struck a metal signpost at approximately 10 to 12 miles per hour after the initial slowdown and rotation. The impact produced a flat, hard smack. Liam's body folded around the post before he fell backward onto the pavement. The back of his head hit the asphalt a second time. The cart clattered to a stop 10 feet downhill. The friend filming dropped the phone, but the recording continued. One friend called emergency services immediately. The operator heard crying in the background. Paramedics arrived approximately 8 minutes later. Liam was unconscious, breathing irregularly. He was transported to the regional hospital. Death was confirmed in the emergency department. The coroner's findings, in plain terms, were a skull fracture at the front of the head from the signpost impact, compounded by a second fracture at the rear from the pavement fall. Severe brain hemorrhage. No helmet. The funeral drew over 200 classmates who stood in a cold drizzle, most of them ironically holding phone cameras. The school issued a general safety warning about dangerous filming trends. Liam's parents released no statement. I genuinely believe that if you show a 16-year-old 100 videos of people surviving stupid things, they will assume they are the 101st. The cart, the hill, the phone. Stupid from the get-go. It was the ordinary math of risk, and Liam Patel ran out of luck before he ran out of hill.
It was March 4th, 2016, and Columbus sat under a flat gray early spring sky. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, that damp, stubborn cold that lingers after winter. Traffic was building into the afternoon rush, lanes filling, signals cycling. Nothing unusual. On paper, it was routine. The danger didn't come from the road. It came from a decision shaped by refusal rather than uncertainty, one that began before the car ever moved. Davenquish was 50 and carried herself like someone who believed she was the exception. Office management had trained her to keep things moving, override problems, and stay in control. People described her as dismissive, someone who minimized concerns and treated caution as unnecessary interruption. Slowing down wasn't just inconvenient to her. It was something she resisted, even when the situation clearly demanded it. That pattern worked in controlled environments. Here, it didn't. That afternoon, she went to a clinic because her body forced the issue. Slurred speech, dizziness, and a severe headache. Clear signs of a stroke in progress, serious enough to interrupt her day. The staff were direct. She should not drive and needed immediate care. Her response wasn't uncertainty, it was dismissal. Documentation showed she minimized her symptoms and rejected further care, prioritizing continuation of her day over the risk already unfolding. The clinic recorded the warning and her decision, creating a clear point where the outcome could have changed. She left anyway. In the parking lot, a bystander noticed something was wrong and tried to intervene. Her condition was visible now: slowed movement, disorientation, the kind of situation that makes strangers step in. She ignored it, got into the car, and drove, continuing as if nothing required her to stop, as if the problem would resolve itself through motion alone. This is where it shifts from frustrating to dangerous. She wasn't just deciding for herself anymore, she was extending that risk to everyone on the road. She entered a multi-lane road as traffic thickened, and within moments, the issue was visible. The car drifted, corrected late, then drifted again. Speed fluctuated without reason. It wasn't aggressive, it was unpredictable. Drivers around her created distance, reacting to something they couldn't fully identify but immediately recognized as unsafe. Inside the vehicle, the stroke was progressing. Blood flow to critical areas of the brain was being restricted in real time. Motor control weakened. Reaction time slowed. Awareness slipped. And despite multiple opportunities to stop earlier, she remained behind the wheel, still in motion, while her ability to control it was actively deteriorating, each second narrowing the margin for recovery. There was no dramatic moment, just a gradual loss of control. The vehicle drifted once more, then slowed to a stop in the lane, engine still running. Traffic moved carefully around it as emergency calls came in. She was found unresponsive in the driver's seat, the vehicle becoming still only after she no longer could continue. What stands out is how many points existed to prevent this. The clinic warned her. A bystander intervened. Drivers recognized it. Every signal was there, and each one was dismissed through action, one after another, until there were no more chances left to take. She was transported to a hospital and later pronounced dead due to complications from the stroke that had already begun before she left the clinic. Investigators confirmed she had been advised not to drive and chose to ignore it. No collision occurred. The incident was classified as a fatal medical emergency while driving, with the critical decisions happening well before the final moment. There was no hidden hazard here, just a progression of decisions where caution was overridden until control was gone and nothing remained to correct it. It was July 18, 2014, on an unlit stretch of Interstate 95 in southern Nevada, where the highway runs flat through open scrubland for 30 miles without a single light source beyond the vehicles using it. Merrick Dunlow was 19 years old and had graduated from a regional high school in Pahrump, Nevada, 6 weeks before that night. He worked part-time at a convenience store off the main commercial strip, pulling closing shifts, stocking shelves, and running the register. People who knew him consistently described the same pattern. He measured his standing among others by how they reacted to him, and the reaction he sought most was the one that came right after something went wrong, but not badly enough to matter. That night, he drove out to the highway that night with 4 friends in 2 vehicles. The game of chicken was not prearranged. It emerged on the shoulder within minutes of stopping, which tells you something about how the group operated. Marek volunteered immediately. 2 friends aimed flashlights across the asphalt from behind the guardrail. A third held a phone up to record. Before I continue with the story, I want you to know that the setup with people on foot and vehicles stopped on a 70 miles per hour interstate would be considered highly illegal and could be grounds for criminal charges if observed by police. 1 vehicle passed in the near lane and the road opened briefly. Marek stepped off the shoulder wearing a dark hoodie that blended into the unlit roadway. Marek reached the painted center line, roughly 24 feet from the shoulder, and stopped. The pause lasted 2 to 3 seconds based on footage recovered from a friend's phone. A pickup traveling eastbound at an estimated 72 miles per hour was approaching from his right. Investigators later placed the distance between Marek and the front of the truck at approximately 650 feet at the moment he went still. At 106 feet per second, that is just over 6 seconds. I've thought about that number more than I expected to when I started writing this. 6 seconds is enough time to understand what is coming toward you, and still not enough time for your body to do anything meaningful about it. Marek did not move. Witnesses on the shoulder later described him as completely stationary, facing the oncoming lane. The pickup driver told investigators he did not see Marek until he was approximately 200 feet away. He applied the brakes immediately, but the truck was still traveling at an estimated 60 miles per hour at the point of contact. The front right corner of the vehicle struck Marek at chest height. The impact threw him approximately 38 feet from the point of strike. He landed on the eastbound shoulder and did not move again. The truck skidded another 90 feet before coming to a full stop. Friends on the shoulder began screaming within seconds of impact. One placed a 911 call immediately. The driver exited his vehicle and remained at the scene. Emergency services only confirmed death when they arrived. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force polytrauma, complete sternal fracture, bilateral pulmonary laceration, traumatic aortic rupture, and severe traumatic brain injury. Consistent with high-speed vehicle strike, death was near instantaneous upon impact. The footage from his friend's phone was reviewed by investigators and subsequently returned to the family. The convenience store where he worked filled his shift within days, not out of indifference, but because the overnight hours still needed to be covered. I think it's a scary thought that the world made a small adjustment and kept moving, and the only people still carrying the full weight of that night are the ones who were standing on the shoulder with flashlights in their hands.